My name is Lacey Quayle, and I am the Livestock Management Extension Specialist for North Dakota State University. I like to say I'm still new, but I don't know if you can say that when you've been in a position for almost a year, but I still feel new, so I still say that. But anyway, a little bit of background. I grew up in eastern South Dakota, raising sheep and commercial cattle, and went to school for animal science. And then when I decided I wanted to pursue graduate school, I focused on reproduction in cattle. So that's my little disclaimer, and that I'm not a geneticist talking about sire selection, but we know that sire selection is a really crucial part of our herd management, right? And something that can really impact our herds for generations. So a big part of livestock management, and very glad to be here tonight speaking with you all. If there's something that, don't be afraid to interrupt me and ask a question. I would much rather this be interactive than me just talking to you guys. So there's a few spots where I'll ask for some input, but anytime during the presentation, feel free to interrupt, and we can have a discussion right then and there. So. All right, so I think it's best to understand the importance of sire selection before we really get going. And I think the best way to do that is to think about the contribution of the sire. So in a herd of cattle, we have representative cattle here. And in a herd of cattle, each female has the opportunity to calve every year, right? We hope that she does, but she has the opportunity to have a calf every year. So she's propagating 50% of her genetics through that calf. But say that each of those cows was bred to the same sire, right? So now we have each of those calves born also carries 50% of those sires' genetics, right? So the cows are propagating their genetics at a single time each year. But the sire part of this is that, the reality is, especially in AI programs, if you're mating a sire to, it could be hundreds of cows or heifers, right? But oftentimes it's dozens of calves. If we're in single sire pastures or whatever it may be, we have dozens of calves that are carrying the genetics from the same sire. So the Beef Cattle Research Council made a graphic that puts this together far better than I could, but it shows kind of visually how the calf crop is impacted by sires going back generations. So the current calf crop is actually influenced by sires for the past 3 generations. And if we think about operations that, especially those that are retaining heifers, that becomes a huge thing to consider, right? As we think about that. And 87% of the calves in the calf crop, or 87% of the genetics of the calf crop, are coming from the last 3 sires used in the herd. So if we think about that in terms of today, right, we're heading into a breeding season here in the next few months. The sire that we choose to use in this breeding season will be genetically influencing calves born in 2028. So that's pretty hard to think about sometimes, but maybe a little overwhelming in that, well, we should probably choose wisely, right? So we get overwhelmed by thinking what's best, right? There are so many different breeds that are out there to use, and then within breed, there are several different sire options, right, to choose from. So how do we know what's best for our operation? And I think maybe the comforting kind of statement there is that best is relative, right? What's best for your operation likely won't be what's best for your neighbor, right? And we're all producing cattle in different environments with different resources to try and reach different goals. So what's best for you is unique, right, to your operation. And so just kind of putting that in a little bit of a perspective. So speaking of goals, I think the first step in sire selection should be to set a direction for your operation, right? Knowing that that you have maybe certain goals that you want to get to, whether that's in 2 to 3 years or 5 to 10 years, right? So I kind of like to think about it as if you were told that you need to build a fence, but you have no idea what type of livestock you need to contain in that fence, right? Keep in or keep out, I guess. So you have no idea what type of livestock you're going to have to deal with. You have no idea if they want you to build conventional or electric fence. No idea how far apart they want the posts or how many strands of wire they want used. So that becomes pretty hard when you go to buy materials, right? I have no idea what direction to go in. And if we're not careful, sire selection isn't necessarily any different, right? We need to have a plan, or maybe kind of critically analyze our operations and know what gaps there might be, or maybe just a direction that we want to move our operation, and have some priorities when we go to think about sire selection. So giving ourselves a specific shopping list for our bull sale, right? Just like a specific shopping list for those fencing materials. Before I move on, I guess I should mention that production goals are going to be different, right? And we kind of touched on this earlier, that if I'm an operation that sells all my calves at weaning and I purchase replacement heifers somewhere else, my production goals probably are going to look different than an operation that retains all of their own replacements, right? And so just thinking about what makes your operation unique and how those goals are different, right? And needing to find sires that help bridge those gaps to get you to reach those goals. So once we have our goals and our priorities in mind, we can set out to search for seed stock producers or producers that have sires for sale. And I think it's important to really to look at producers that maybe raise cattle in a similar environment or have similar production goals or management styles as what you know that yours are, right? So we are expecting a sire to sire calves into an environment that, if it's very different from an environment where they were previously siring calves, right, that can promote some differences, right? And so thinking about the environment that an operation is raising cattle in and what their goals are, we would want to put emphasis on something that maybe is similar to what we expect to be raising cattle in. So after you identify a few producers that you'd like to look at a little closer, then you kind of can start the evaluation process of actual individual sires. And I also think it's important that we include the reference sires in on this evaluation, right? So we not only want to see the sires that are up for sale, but we want to take a look at other generations, especially when we start to think about longevity and soundness of those sires. This is also something to really consider if you do retain replacement heifers, making sure that you get eyes on the dam of the sire that you're interested in, right? How does her teat and udder structure look? And overall soundness look, as far as, you know, from a longevity standpoint, knowing how crucial those things are to productivity. And then lastly is to have a budget, right? And I don't know how much more I can really say on that, and that having a budget that you're willing to stick to, right? And then finding a sire that reaches those goals that you have, but does that in the budget that you've set for yourself. So all this to say is that the goal of sire selection is to use every possible bit of information that you have available to you, because we want to make an informed decision, just like the fencing project, right? We want to be able to have all the information that we can, all the tools in our toolkit, to make sure that we're finding the best fit for our operation. So this means that we're taking into account several different things. When it comes to sire selection, there's going to be components of individual performance, right? What was his actual birth weight or actual weaning weight, yearling weight, things like that, that you can analyze. There's also a visual appraisal, right? We call that phenotype. And this is especially crucial when I mentioned like the feet and leg structure, hip structure, how an animal can last and really reach that longevity component. This is where the teat and udder structure of that sire's dam really comes into play. And just knowing that if you have a certain frame score of cattle, finding a sire that fits your desired phenotype, along with a sound, structurally sound sire, all kind of wraps into that piece. And then if we have phenotype, we also have genotype, right? So that's the EPD side of sire selection, which we'll get into a little bit more. But the point is that all of these pieces of the puzzle serve a purpose in sire selection, and we shouldn't, totally negate one and focus really heavily on the other. They all need to play a role in our decision. So I'd like to dive a little deeper into the EPD side of the equation, knowing that they can maybe be one of the more confusing things or overwhelming parts of the selection process, because there can be lots of numbers, right? And making sure that they're relevant to you is important. So EPD stands for expected progeny difference, and it's a number, a calculated number that serves as a prediction that estimates a sire's ability to transmit his genetic potential to offspring. And it's something that can be either positive or negative. And we'll go through lots of examples, so hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. But the way an EPD is calculated is that actual individual performance data that I mentioned, that gets sent to a breed association, and they have a model or an equation that they plug that into. And that model can also include the performance data of other relatives of that sire. So if that bull has several calves already in the system, or he's got siblings, his dam or sire, the individual performance data of all of those relatives can also get included into the equation. And so then from that equation, that's how an EPD is calculated. So along with an EPD, oftentimes there'll be an accuracy value. So that value is from 0 to 1, and it approaches 1 the more accurate or the more confident we are in that EPD. So what that means is that we're more confident in that EPD isn't going to change as more progeny are added, for example, right? So a bull that is younger, that maybe doesn't have as many progeny out there in the system, their accuracy values may be low, or they may not even be reported on a younger bull like that. Whereas mature bulls likely have more data and more progeny, more of those connections that help increase that accuracy. And so that's where that number comes from. This is a good time, I think, for me to say that with all EPDs, it's important to only compare EPDs from sires within the same breed. The reason being, and this is the same for index values, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but different breed associations have different equations, right? I mentioned that you plug in that individual birth weight or individual weaning weight into that equation, and that calculates the EPD. Well, different breed associations have different models of doing that. So that's why it's important to only compare sires within the same breed. That is to say that the USDA Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, their genetic team has worked to make an across-breed comparison, and what the adjustment factor, I guess, would be between breeds. So that's something that is calculated, and they report that. So you can use that in certain situations. But if you were to just compare bulls, from between two catalogs, and you should compare sires of the same breed, right? If you have two different catalogs and two different breeds of bulls, that wouldn't be accurate to compare those, even though they do report some of the same EPDs. They're calculated differently. Okay, so I wanted to throw this up just as an example of, like, you get an abbreviation of an EPD, but what does it actually stand for, and then how does it pertain to your operation? And so this is not exhaustive by any means, and I just picked a few that might be kind of more universal, not necessarily stuck to a specific association. But then there are some that are only reported by a select association, right? And so this comes right off of the association's website. You can find this for any association, what EPDs they report. But to go through and kind of explain what they are and how they might be relevant, I think one of the questions I get most, or one of the things that's maybe confused the most, is calving ease direct versus maternal calving ease. And so how they differ, so those are the first two listed in this table. Calving ease direct will either be listed as CED or sometimes just CE for calving ease. And so that is measured as a percent, and it's the percent of unassisted births when that sire is mated to heifers. So a 2-year-old heifer that's calving that was mated to this sire, how many percentage of unassisted births? Versus maternal calving ease or calving ease maternal, it can be reported either way. That's the percent of unassisted births in a sire's daughters. So we're one generation further, right? And so just kind of knowing the difference between those, and again, implications for your operation, right? If you're retaining heifers or not, this could be a crucial difference to know. I think another one that often maybe gets misunderstood is the milk EPD. So that's either going to be listed as maternal milk or just milk. And it is measured in pounds. You'll see it over there on the side. It says pounds for units, but it's not pounds of milk production. It's actually pounds of weaning weight that is due to milk production in a sire's daughters. So something to be aware of there. Some of the more universal or consistent, I guess, as far as abbreviations go, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and carcass weight, those are all pretty consistent across associations as far as their abbreviation, and they're all measured in pounds. So when we get to kind of some examples here, and we can go through how different bulls compare, but that's measured in pounds. The Hereford Association reports udder and teat score, and that's measured in a scale point system of 1 to 9, and that would be of the sire's daughters. There's also a few longevity EPDs depending on the association, and that's measured as a probability. So it's the percent of a sire's daughters, or the probability of a sire's daughters sticking around in the herd for an extended period of time. So just kind of some examples that, like I said, it's not exhaustive, but very similar tables to this are reported on breed association websites. So definitely something to look into, to know what they're defined as and how they're abbreviated.
So Lacey, going back to that chart, so just so that I know, the maternal calving ease and the calving ease maternal are both used interchangeably, but they're still meaning the same thing under that unit.
So some associations might say maternal calving ease, other associations might list it as calving ease maternal, just a different abbreviation.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so now we can kind of move into indexes. So that's a number in the list of EPDs. That's usually a number that the heading will have a dollar sign with it. Typically, sometimes they don't. But that's more of an economic type of a number assigned to that bull, and they're typically designed for a specific scenario. And how they kind of develop these is they are calculated by taking a suite or a group of traits that might have economic relevance for a specific situation. So we'll go through examples after this, but there could be a whole handful, like 6 or more, several traits, several EPDs that have economic relevance to a specific scenario, and they're combined, again, in an equation to end up with one value. And so these values are, the unit for them is either pounds per head or pounds per carcass. And each trait then in that equation is weighted. based off of the scenario. And the thing that's specific really about indexes is that they consider both inputs and outputs. So if you think how revenue is an important part of economics, but expenses are too, right? And so in a situation in the cattle industry, weaning weight might be something that we think about on the revenue side of the equation. But dry matter intake, or kind of a measure of feed efficiency, would be on the expense side, right, on the input side of the equation. And so an index really works to try to balance both of those. The flip side of that, or just something to be aware of with index values, are that we don't necessarily know all the traits that might be included in an index value, and we don't necessarily they're not necessarily relevant to everyone based on their situation, right? So they may have economic relevance, but because your production goals might be different from someone else's, they may not be as relevant to you. We also don't know, I talked about how the traits are weighted in that equation, but we don't know how much each trait is weighted compared to the next one, right? It's not equal weight necessarily among all of them. And so this is not to say, positive or negative, right? It's just something to be aware of when we do look at index values, kind of how they're calculated and what they mean. So very similarly, again, not an exhaustive list, but just grabbed a few index values or abbreviations and kind of what they stand for, and from the association website was able to pull what EPDs they list, what EPDs are included for some of the associations. So, for example, in the Hereford Association, they have a Baldy maternal index. So that's listed as BMI $, and that's they list that as kind of their maternal index, which means that they're when they have the explanation on their website, they're saying how they're focusing on a scenario where you're going to be retaining heifers, right? So that's their maternal index. Their terminal index is CHB $, so certified Hereford beef. And in this scenario, they describe it as all of the progeny are going to be targeted to producing certified Hereford beef. And so they're picking traits that might be more or less important, right, towards that goal of producing certified Hereford beef. And so they list EPDs, carcass weight, marbling, average daily gain, ribeye area, dry matter intake, and fat. So those are the EPDs that are in that equation to calculate that index value. Okay, so now we kind of have a list of maybe a few available EPDs, right, and a few available index values and kind of how they're calculated. But how do we use them, right? That's kind of the bigger question. We want our cattle to be able to be working for us, right? Not the other way around. And so how do we use EPDs and index values as another tool in that toolkit, right? To make some of these decisions when it comes to sire selection. So I thought maybe the best way to do this was to put together maybe a scenario, and then be able to work through maybe what might be some priorities and maybe what EPDs would align with those priorities as kind of a mock real world scenario, right? So I just kind of tried to come up with a production goal that we could work through. And so let's say that we're raising commercial Angus cross cows. We typically use Hereford sires, and we're selling all the calves at weaning, with the exception of we are retaining replacement heifers. And with those replacement heifers, we're going to AI them, and we're going to keep back anything that gets bred early, that gets bred to AI. But anything that's late bred or comes up open, we're going to sell to someone else as a replacement heifer for a different production system, right? We're grazing a range environment, and we want to graze as much of the year as possible. That's our goal. And we have approximately a 1,200-pound mature cow size. So that's kind of the framework that I kind of just threw together for this example. And I thought, what are some priorities that you think maybe we should have for sire selection? This is the part where you guys get to unmute and let me know maybe what some priorities might be.
This is a very good presentation. My priorities for for this section will probably be the CED and the birth weight, the milk as well. So most likely I will be concentrating on a light birth weight bowl. That would be my priority, and the weaning weight as well.
Sure, right. We're selling weaned calves.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts or different perspective or something else that you think should be a priority?
I don't know. I'm throwing this out there. Maybe calving ease maternal.
Okay. Yeah, why do you say that?
Maybe calving ease in those first time heifers. I don't know. Maybe this is what I'm
Yeah.
guessing.
So yeah, everyone has, just like at the beginning when I said, we're all going to have different production goals. Even if we have the same production goal, everyone is going to have a different perspective on what they want to prioritize, right? So that's important to remember when we go through this, especially because when I was going through this, I had to write down, well, what some priorities would be. I got to thinking, well, there's some degree of maternal focus, right? I mentioned that we're retaining replacement heifers, so we do have some degree of maternal focus. Now, whether you want to make that a huge focus for you or maybe a secondary focus, that's up to you. But we do have maybe some maternal focus there, and some of the EPDs, if we're using a Hereford sire, so some of the Hereford Association EPDs that maybe we'd want to look at. That SCF is sustained cow fertility. So that is the longevity, kind of the measure of longevity for that. And so that's the probability that a heifer born of this sire would stay in the herd for 12 years. So that's what sustained cow fertility means. That's a more maternal focused EPD, right? We've got MCW, so that's maternal cow weight. Thinking that, I listed, we got 1,200 pound mature cow size, wanting to make sure that we match our environment, right? And match that cow size that we're trying to keep consistent. Maybe we could take a look at that. We've got MCE, that maternal calving ease. Like Mikkel said, we're retaining those heifers that are going to be a part of our herd, we hope, for a long time. And so thinking about how they are able to calve and their calving ease could be important. The udder and teat score, again, that's something that just is kind of related to longevity and productivity and how a cow stays productive over a long period of time. And then the very first one I listed is SC. So that's scrotal circumference. And like I mentioned before, my background is reproduction, and there's a great genetic correlation that we talk about quite often in sire selection on that side of things, and that sires that have greater scrotal circumference, the genetic correlation then is to daughters that reach puberty at a younger age. And so that's why I listed scrotal circumference there just as a potential priority, in that we'd want to make sure that, or maybe potentially look for that as kind of a measure of reproductive efficiency. Okay, another priority. I mentioned that we're selling weaned calves, right? So we get paid when we sell weaned calves, that means we get paid on the number of calves. So that means we have to have live calves born and the pounds that they wean, right? And so kind of some traits or EPDs that are associated with those things would be weaning weight, like we mentioned earlier, and then calving ease, right? So calving ease would be something that would work towards that kind of that live calf component. I wrote down potential for limited inputs, and this may or may not be true, right? And this is something that definitely varies from operation to operation and across environments. But if there's any potential during the time of the year in your operation where there could be limited grazing or limited inputs, we have to kind of balance that with how our cows are producing, right? And so to produce milk, it takes energy. And knowing that that's a huge energy requirement when cattle are lactating, that's something to balance with what we have available in our environment. And then I also listed that BMI index, right? That balding maternal index, and just something that like I said before, we know kind of the things that the EPDs that went into that index. And if you notice, some of the ones that go into that index are similar to ones that we've talked about as maybe being priorities, right? The weaning weight, that sustained cow fertility, that longevity component. But there's also some pretty key differences, right? CW, carcass weight, marbling, ribeye area, those are all used to calculate that index value. But are those necessarily important if we're selling weaned calves, right? How much importance do we put on marbling or ribeye area if we're not retaining ownership and selling our calves on the grid, right? So if we're selling at weaning, we might think maybe a little differently and put a little less emphasis on some of those carcass traits. So that's just an example of how what goes into an index value might not necessarily be relevant to every production operation, even though some things might be, not everything might be.
I have a question regarding the index value. Will that disposition be calculated in there too? Like, let's say some bulls are very nervous, some bulls are very calm.
Sure.
And this position calculated from there, or just per observation of how their sire's um, attitudes are.
So not every association calculates a docility EPD, right? So that's one of those that some associations do, but others don't. And so if you're looking at a sire of a particular breed and they don't calculate a disposition or a docility score, then you're kind of left with what you just said, right? Observation and being around the animal. Maybe that's part of the at the beginning when I said about taking a look at the entire operation, right? And if you go visit and you walk through the cow herd or you walk through the bulls for sale, and that's something to kind of notice more behaviorally, observationally, like you mentioned, versus not every association actually calculates an EPD for it. Great
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah.
Is that DMI under your limited inputs, is that just pertaining to Herefords only, or does that go for Angus as well?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I'm
Right,
not
is
sure.
that like what you mentioned from the beginning? Is that comparing different types of breeds? They're going
Yeah,
to
so to clarify, like several breeds calculate the same EPDs. They just calculate them in a different way sometimes, and so that's why we can't compare. Even if we see a DMI, a dry matter intake EPD for two different breeds, without knowing that adjustment factor, we can't compare them accurately.
Okay.
Okay, great questions. Okay, so I copy and pasted those priorities, and yet, like I said, they're subjective. There may not be everyone's priorities, right? But they could be potential priorities. And I've got a list of mock bulls, right? Sire A, B, C, D, and some all the way out to the EPDs. And I just highlighted the things that maybe we touched on, but we can take a look at a lot of other things too. But I think, at least for me, what would be helpful is to just go through like how we would compare them, right? So let's take calving ease direct here. Like if who remembers how that's measured? Is it in pounds or is it in
Uh, well, I try to study the APDs when I'm like shopping for bulls, and I was told that CED should be higher and the birth weight should be very low. So mainly I concentrate on the birth weight on these Angus bulls because sometimes I'm not out there while during calving season. And that's the main thing I look at, and then plus the weaning weight and then the milk.
Yep.
If it's higher, it's better. Um, that's my understanding. Let's say I would probably like the bull C if I'm not gonna be there around them for the first time heifers.
Yeah, so I would like to start. I just wanted to be able to compare what the different numbers mean, right, between bulls. So CED we talked about as being calving ease direct. It's a percent of unassisted births when these sires would be mated to heifers, right? So nothing to do with his daughters, just when this sire is mated to heifers. And so being a percent, you can take the difference between we're all Hereford, we're all in the same breed, so we can compare, and that 9.7% for sire A versus 1% for sire B, we would expect sire A to sire 8.7 more unassisted births, right? So we would, I, like we mentioned, a higher number for calving ease direct means that you're having more unassisted births versus birth weight is measured in pounds, right? And it's a comparison of bull B has a birth weight EPD of 5.6 compared to this this 0.7, the difference between those would be 4.9. So sire B would sire calves that on average are 4.7, or excuse me, 4.9 pounds heavier at birth compared to sire D. And so that's, you just take the difference between the EPD, and this is where it kind of becomes important what the units are, right? So whether it's percent of calves unassisted, or it's pounds of birth weight or pounds of weaning weight, that milk EPD is pounds of weaning weight that's attributed to milk production, right? And so we're able to kind of I like to, if we have a group of bulls like this that maybe you've identified that they have one area or a few areas that maybe you like, then you can put them together and you can see what the spread is between them, right? So when we look at calving ease, we've got a 15% difference between these four bulls, right? Which, if you think about it, for 100 cows, that's 15 calves for every 100 cows difference, right, in unassisted births. That can be a pretty big deal. When we think about this birth weight, we've got less of a spread there, right? Kind of a difference of maybe 6 or so pounds between birth weights. So they're much closer when it comes to average birth weight from calves sired by these bulls. Our weaning weight, again, that's in pounds. We've got our highest as 85 pounds in this group, and our lowest is 65 pounds. So we've got a spread of 20 pounds that, bull B on average would sire calves that are 20 pounds heavier at weaning compared to sire D, right? So this wasn't, the goal wasn't to pick, like the silver bullet sire that we thought would do best in this scenario, but instead pick out things that, we can see how one sire might excel in an area versus another sire in a different area. And that's kind of how you go about this sire selection, right? You have to determine, I put my priority on something maybe differently than someone else, so I'm going to prioritize a different EPD maybe than someone else, and that's how the cattle industry goes. That's what makes part of it so great. But anyway, I did also want to point out how this index, right? We've got a spread of what, 420 again. Now this would be dollars per head, so $420 per head, and 572 is our highest in this group. So that's a difference of $152 per head. So what I kind of wanted to mention is, just because the index is the highest value, we still should look at these individual traits to make sure that they line up with our priorities, right? So in this kind of mock scenario, right, if this weaning weight number isn't where I'd like it to be, or the sustained cow fertility number isn't where I'd like it to be, even though that index value is high, that doesn't necessarily mean that he might fit our operation best. I think we can go pretty far as comparing these bulls to each other when we have a few picked out. But I think, would it be helpful if you knew the averages overall of a breed, right? And so the breed associations list an average, and that's listed on their website. So you can tell, just because we had a spread of 15% for calving East Direct or 20 pounds of weaning weight between our group, how do they each individually compare to the average? And so you can see here that all of our bulls in this group are above the average for the weaning weight EPD, right? And this is just something that may or may not change your perspective, right? If you have a bull picked out or are looking at a specific EPD, but another tool in the toolbox to help us. So good to know averages. It's also good to know what's called a percentile ranking. And so again, this is listed on an association website. I pulled this from the Hereford Association, and it's where a bull ranks within the breed. So we just talked about average, but now with just an average, you either know if the bull is above or below the average, right? You don't know really how far in terms of the rest of the bulls of the breed. So when we put up our mock scenario here, we could see that our average calving ease direct is 3.6. Percent, right? And we have one bull that's below average. So he's at 1.0. And if you find that down here in the list, 1.0 is down here at the 70th percentile. So that means that 70% of the bulls in the breed have a higher calving ease direct compared to that bull, right? So that's kind of another tool in the toolkit that not only can we compare to the average, but we can see across the breed. And this is usually they list like 8,000 some sires that have produced at least 10 calves. So they'll usually list that, but with how many sires they're comparing to. But you can see where they fall amongst all of those. Okay, so all this to say is that best is relative, right? We just went through an example, and like I mentioned, the point wasn't to come out of the presentation with the bull that we thought was going to do the best. The point was to know how to compare them and know if your priority is calving ease or if your priority is weaning weight, or if they're both your priorities. How do you weigh them, right? How do you balance that across bulls, and how do you compare them accurately? I was also, we're going to kind of switch gears, but I also was asked to maybe touch on a few things on heifer selection. And this is a topic that I absolutely love, being from the reproduction side of the equation, making sure that, we're searching for heifers that stick around in our herds for a long period of time and are very reproductively efficient. And so I think the easiest way to answer the question of what makes a good heifer is to think about what, a good heifer is one that makes a good cow. And so we know from some pretty foundational research that reproductive traits are 5 times more valuable compared to calf growth. And the reason that is that the longer a cow stays around and continually rebreeds, that's compounding economically. And so thinking about that reproduction component, that longevity component, we have to calculate something called cow depreciation. And not saying that you have to calculate this specifically for every cow, but just something to think about, right? In that a heifer has a replacement cost to her. It takes money to develop that heifer, to breed that heifer to where she'll calve the first time. And when she leaves the herd, hopefully at an old age, she has a salvage value. So we take the difference between those, and if we divide it by the number of years that she spent as a productive member of the herd, calving every year, that's when we get our yearly cow depreciation costs. And we'd love that to be as low as possible. And we can lower that by increasing the number of years that she sticks around in the herd. So if we want to prepare heifers to have calves in a timely manner and stick around for several years, I think it's pretty safe to say that we should be preparing our replacement heifers to carry out the same expectations or same responsibilities as they would have, you know, as a cow in our herd, right? So thinking about that longevity component and sticking around for a long time. So before we even develop our heifers and then we think about breeding them and calving them out, we have to first of all know the selection criteria that we even, to get to that point, we have to know what heifers we want to even sort off and keep around. And I think it's safe to say that history repeats itself, right? And that's true with you know, human history, that's true in the cattle industry. And so I think we need to make sure that we consider the cow for sure when we're thinking about replacement decisions, right? And this again is subjective depending on the importance that you place on one kind of consideration versus another, right? So things like dystocia, when they're getting bred and calving the next year, if they ever fail to wean a calf, maybe a cow has some teat and udder problems that you need to consider. And then of course, docility or that temperament. And these are all things that are very subjective, right? Depending on the operation, but things that we can consider for replacements. But all those things aside, right, those answers to those other questions are going to vary from herd to herd and operation to operation. But there's been considerable research done on heifer heifer selection and how we can keep heifers that are going to perform well and for a long time in our herd. And so we kind of summarize that in a few what I hope are non-negotiables, and that's that we want to keep heifers that are born within the first 21 days of the calving season. So that's just a reflection of that dam getting pregnant in the first heat cycle, getting bred in the first 21 days of the breeding season. And if we can, we want to focus on heifers that are born to mature cows, those being about 4 years of age or older. And the reason for that is that when we look at the ovaries of heifers from mature cows, there's a few things that are indicative of maybe a little higher fertility compared to heifers that are born from younger cows. And then, of course, we need to think about heifers that are fitting the desired phenotype, right? If you have a certain frame score that works well in your environment, you know, taking all those things into consideration. Okay, so I keep mentioning that we want to keep replacement heifers that are born in the first 21 days of the calving season. And that statement comes from some research done out of Nebraska. And it looked at the weaning and pre-breeding weights of heifers, as well as the reproductive performance of those heifers, whether they were born in the first, second, or 21 days of the calving season. And so those periods just represent whether that cow got pregnant in the first, second, or third heat cycle of the breeding season. And so this study wasn't done in 2024, but I thought I'd put it kind of in perspective for if you were going to be breeding those heifers here shortly. And so we've got a calving season, a fake calving season here from April to June, split up into 3 different time points. And these are the weights from that study. So heifers that were born earlier in the calving season, they weaned at heavier weights compared to these heifers that were born later in the calving season. And that pattern follows out to pre-breeding. So thinking about this year, going into breeding season in a few months, they were about 50 pounds heavier, those heifers that were early born compared to a later born heifer. And so there's been some associations, right, with the weight at pre-breeding and if that heifer is cycling and ready to be bred. And so that's kind of the advantage that we're getting at there. Going into that reproductive efficiency part, they also looked after that first breeding season, they looked at pregnancy rates. And heifers that were born in the first 21 days of the calving season, you know, a year and a half before, they had 90% pregnancy rates compared to the 78% of heifers that were born in the third 21-day period. So we're increasing pregnancy rates on those heifers that were born earlier. And then, of course, that translates pretty directly to if they're getting pregnant, overall they have greater pregnancy rates, but they're also getting pregnant earlier. So we're perpetuating this cycle, right? Heifers that are born early in the calving season also become first calf heifers that calve early themselves. So 81% of those heifers were actually calving in the first 21 days of their first calving season. The reason that's important is that not only are those heifers staying around, or excuse me, not only are those heifers have greater pregnancy rates, but like I mentioned, a greater percentage of them are getting pregnant early. And so that translates to that longevity component. So a different research study in Nebraska still, but a different study showed that the heifers that gave birth early in their first calving season, they were far more likely to stick around in the herd from years 5 to 9. So there's more of them in the herd out there at that longer time period after 5 to 9 years. And if we think about that from a weaning weight perspective, they also looked at every calf that those heifers raised for those 9 years. They took weaning weights on them, and what they found was if you actually take the difference between the black bar and the white bar, and you add it up over the first 6 years, they're weaning the weight of an additional calf in those first 6 years. So heifers that calve early in their first calving season, they're weaning heavier calves for 6 years, to where, when we think about profitability and productivity, that's a huge consideration when we think about increasing our weaning weight, that those heifers are or females, right, are able to produce in her lifetime. So kind of to summarize all of this on replacement heifers, it's important that we think about retaining heifers that were born in the first 21 days of the calving season. If you're someone that is making replacement decisions slightly later, and you can't necessarily make that decision when they're born during the calving season, definitely focus on the heifers that get pregnant early in their first breeding season. Because those are going to be the same heifers that are going to calve early in their first calving season, and that's where that longevity component comes in, and that those heifers are staying in the herd longer, and they're weaning heavier calves for the first 6 years of their life. So all things considered, when we kind of add up everything, if we focus on those heifers that are either born early or conceive early in their first breeding season, we're working towards more live calves by sticking around longer and that greater longevity, which translates directly to profitability. So I'm almost certain that I'm over time, but I've appreciated the questions throughout, and if there's any questions now, I'd be happy to have a discussion and see if we can't get something answered. So, and if I can't answer it, I don't know, I'm absolutely happy to follow up with you and do some research and get back with you.
Thank you, Lacey. If you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or insert them.
Please.
No
Lacey?
question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No question, Lacey, but your presentation was very interesting, and I'm really concentrate on um my first 21-day heifers that are barned for replacement. But from the past, I've been like kind of looking at the disposition of calves. If they're big, maybe they were born like maybe the second 21 days or something like that. But now my goal is going to be targeting the first 21 days born calves. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I had a question.
Sure.
Can we go back to that breed averages that you were discussing when you were talking
Sure.
about the APD values?
I'll reshare my screen.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Okay. Breed averages. The percentile or?
Oh, you just passed it. The next,
Yep.
yep, that one. So where you were kind of talking about one of the bulls, CED was around about 16.
Yep.
So that CED of that bull I see in that percentile breakdown is the upper 1%. So what would that mean for that bull?
So that means that there's less than 1% of bulls that have a higher CED than he does. So he's one of the maybe the best performers in that EPD, compared to others and in the breed.
Compared to that one point oh CED that you said that his
So that
average is 70%.
Well, that the CED of 1, that means that he's in the 70th percentile. So 70% of the bulls in the breed are above him in that CED category. So it's no different than I mean it's flip-flopped, but when
Right.
human babies are weighed or measured, right, they're in the 95th percentile or they're in the 99th percentile. In cattle, the 1 percentile is the higher, right? That there's fewer bulls ahead of them, for example, or to say, right? So kind of the same way to think about it, as far as how they're performing and how many bulls might be performing either um, above that or below that.
Okay. All right. So typically saying that, anything before, above that 4 percentile up there is going to be pretty good.
So that's there's different ways to look at it, right? So there are some producers that they like to find bulls that maybe they have their priority traits and they want to find a bull that's maybe in the top 10% or top 15%. And so it's just kind of a different way to look at it, right? If if they do report percentiles or you're able to look them up and compare them, that can be helpful to know like how many or what percentage of the bulls of that breed are above or below that. So it's just another way to look at it, right? And depending how you like to think about things, it can be helpful.
Okay. All right. I just had a question about that, but thank you.
No,
Um,
that's great.
anyone have any questions for Lacey? You're more than welcome to unmute yourself or insert your question in the chat box.
Yeah. And if you think of something later, absolutely email me or give me a phone call or whatever.
Okay. All right. Well, I will go ahead and conclude our presentation for tonight. Lacey, I will get back with you to see if I can get a copy of your presentation slides. We do share them on our platform. So if anyone that may have missed out on our webinar and would want a copy of how you explain the abbreviations of those CEDs, or not CEDs, the EPDs, sorry,
A
then
lot
they
of
can.
abbreviations.
Yeah, right. Yeah, a lot of them. So a lot of index values too. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of intrigued about them. Okay, so we do have, okay, thank you, Lacey from Marjorie. All right, so that will conclude our presentation tonight. Lacey, we'll get back in touch with you, but thank you again. You're more than welcome to stick around and just hear about our upcoming updates that we have, but you're more than welcome to exit out. But we'll go ahead and conclude our tonight's presentation. So thank you, Lacey. Oh,
Thank you,
we'll
everyone.
be in touch soon.
All right. Thanks.
All right. So, for those of you that are still on here, I did forget to release the polls. So let me do that real quick before I move forward. All right, so there will be a Sire selection pop-up that will be in front of you right now. So if you don't mind taking a minute of your time to complete that poll of ours, I really appreciate that. Anything that you include in the additional comment section is basically up to you of how you want to, how you feel about this webinar. Was it complicated? Was it pretty interesting? Do we need to expand more in depth on how to implement, EPD or the dollar index values. By all means, make it more detailed if you like. The more detailed, the better, because it kind of gives me an idea of what we should be providing the next go around. So if you guys can put that in additional comments, if it's not pertaining to this webinar, and if you're wanting to have, more of crop type of related webinars or in-person events, definitely put that in additional comments. And even though if you feel like this is a bit, complicated for my taste, we need to bring something a little bit down to my understanding, feel free to put that in the additional comment section. I really appreciate every, bit of information that you guys give us. So while you guys are filling out the polls for me, I'm going to go ahead and kind of go through with you guys our upcoming events. So we do have a basic conservation plan workshop this coming Thursday. So this is pertaining to the District 19 grazing permit meeting, but basically if you are a grazing permit holder in Northern agency, I mean, this will be a good opportunity for you to be part of this workshop. We will have Ms. Shirley Toth present on identifying natural resource concerns, creating operational maps on soil and vegetation report, developing management plans for livestock, ranch, and farm. So if, all that checks your boxes, I highly recommend coming over on this Thursday, starting at 10 a.m. at Herfido chapter. So, like I said, if you are a grazing permit holder and conservation plan is basically one of those items that you need to check off to get your grazing permit approved, definitely swing on by. Okay. So, we do have 2 sheep shearing workshops. You see them right in front of you. So, but they're in 2 different locations. Just we'll leave it like that. So on the 17th, we have one from 9 to 4, and this is going to be located at Bahala chapter. If you guys haven't been there, it's in Vanderwagen. So lunch will be provided. If you are interested in shearing, I definitely suggest, wearing comfortable clothes and wear comfortable shoes. And if you want to shear, definitely bring your hand shears or bring your electric shears along with an extension cord. There's a limited amount of shearing equipment, so the only shearing equipment that will be available will be the presenters, but he's going to be using that for his own demonstration purposes. So you'll be, discovering how to oil shears and sharpening them, as well as how to set up sheep properly, especially on how to effectively shear the fastest and the most safest way possible, and as well as maintaining your shearing equipment. So we do have a professional shearer coming down, and he's definitely going to show you guys the ropes on how to do that. And we also have spring vaccine scheduling that we need to start thinking about as a sheep producer. So we definitely want to keep those diseases at bay. And if there's any external or internal parasites, they're definitely going to come up this summer. So if you want to gear up on any of those information on common diseases and how to apply the best protocol, definitely I would suggest attending this workshop. And the following day on April 18th, still 9 to 4, this one's going to be presented at Cow House Auction. None of you are pretty aware about it. It's the auction located in Kirtland. So you can pretty much Google all the locations of these areas and it'll tell you exactly where they are. So we do ask for everyone to register. So please, if you are logging in from your computer, scan that QR code and it will take you straight to the registration page. As well as if you're coming, make sure you wear comfortable clothing. All right, so the livestock first aid training, this one's going to be the following week in April. This will be on the 22nd of April from 8 to 5. This is going to be located at Baja Chapter House in Vanderwagen. So for those of you that will be attending, you would have to attend the full day's training, and this is going to be 1 bag per family. So if you guys could, if you're interested in wanting to learn about scheduling vaccination for both cattle and sheep, practice how to do external suturing, as well as dystocia problems. So we'll be working on a cow-calf model that's coming down from NMSU, and we will be going through those scenarios. So there's more to it, but if you guys want, go ahead and scan that QR code and register. We do need people to register that way. This event's lunch is being catered, so we do need a number of folks who are registering. So a week prior to this event, there will be an email sent out to everyone, letting them know, or you know, that you have basically registered for this training workshop. So that's that. We do have a conservation planning program that I just touched base on a moment ago when we were talking about the CP workshop. So if you are a rancher or farmer that have a grazing permit located either in Eastern or Northern Navajo Agency, you know how complex those conservation plans can be, especially if it's your first time. So if you are in the need of assistance, we do basically for free. We have you contact Miss Shirley Toth, and she's our resource specialist. So her email is there if you are interested on having a one-on-one, or if you are grazing land board or grazing official or farm board. Definitely, if you're interested in having a conservation planning workshop, we definitely can set that up. Sorry. Oh, okay. All right. So if you guys are from your phone, tuning in from your phone, I highly suggest going on to our Facebook page that has all of our upcoming events posted, as well as our Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project website. Everything is pretty much updated. This webinar will be edited and posted sometimes next week. So if you want to look on to our upcoming events website, or on the NSA project website under upcoming events, you can register there as well if you are tuning in through your phone. But I see everyone pretty much completed our polls, so I thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And so all of your feedback is greatly appreciated. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we will see you guys all sometimes the next webinar or the next in-person event. So thank you, and you guys all have a good rest of your day. Short, we're called the NSA Project, and we're the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service under NMSU. And our project is funded by USDA Outreach and Assistance for Native Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers program. So our project partners on here, you probably see a lot of their logos on each and every one of our flyers, from in-person workshops to webinars.
And those folks are going to be the Nate College Land Grant Office, and as well as the Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment, and the USDA logos, and the Cooperative Extension Service. So those are our project partners that we collaborate a lot when it comes to all of our educational activities. So the past couple months, you probably see composting webinars that we had brought from January, and that was presented by some of our specialists coming from the main campus at NMSU, as well as livestock record keeping was presented by the NSA staff. We had the Nate College Land Grant from last week's event from Spring Food Summit, and as well as our great Carol Palmer from COPE, whom you guys have attended some of her webinars and in-person activities on food preservations. So we partner a lot with you guys based on the overview that we have accumulated from you guys as viewers. So we tailor our workshops and webinars based on the feedback that you have given us. So that is definitely what we use as a platform for every year. So the more that you give us in the comments after this session, we definitely use those comments in part of our yearly activities. So another one that we also invite is increasing our producers' knowledge in USDA programs. All of you guys are pretty much aware of NRCS and FSA, what they stand for, what type of services that they provide, as well as maybe rural development and risk management agency. So if you guys haven't been part of our journey, we have been conducting webinar series kind of tailored to some of the USDA services such as NRCS and FSA, and other resource providers such as Navajo Nation Department of Ag, giving them the platform virtually to kind of show that you could apply for as a producer such as yourselves, from ranching, going through equipped, or applying for any drought loss assistance through FSA. And lastly, increasing local productions and consumption of fresh fruits and veggies and healthy foods by Navajo families and individuals.